Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thank you for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're delighted to be joined by Stephen Heintz, who is the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Stephen is doing some really important work in the world of global affairs and philanthropy. And so we're going to have a lot of wide-ranging topics to touch on. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephen. He has an undergraduate degree in American Studies from Yale, worked initially in his career in state government in Connecticut, then served as the vice president of the East-West Institute, and was based in Prague from 1990 to 1997. So obviously a hugely important time as the wall came down and Europe was reinventing itself. Stephen then came back to the US. He helped create Demos, which is a very well-respected public policy institute that focuses on racial and economic justice. And then he became president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in 2001. So has been there for nearly a quarter of a century and is doing some really important work in the realm of kind of thought leadership and also shaping public policy in the United States and elsewhere. In addition to his work at RBH, as it's called, RBF, excuse me. Stephen is involved in lots of important projects. He was a co-chair of a commission on the practice of democratic citizenship in the 21st century, which several years ago issued a really important report called Our Common Purpose. He sits on a number of boards. He's the chairman of the board of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and is also on the board of the International Crisis Group. A year or so ago, a little less than that, Stephen wrote a really terrific paper called A Logic for the Future, International Relations in the Age of Turbulence. It came out last fall, I believe. A really terrific and interesting report that's gotten a lot of attention, generated a lot of discussion. So we're going to drill down on that and some of his other projects. And Stephen is joining us from his office in New York City. So Stephen, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, John, and with your audience. Thank you for having me.
Great, great. Well, Stephen, as I looked at your career, I noticed there's so many things we could talk about, but one thing that caught my eye was that you began in Connecticut state government, and one of your first jobs was working for a Senate Majority Leader by the name of Joe Lieberman. Tell us about that experience. How did that come about?
Well, it was, all through my career, I've been extraordinarily lucky, right from the beginning. And that happened because the year I graduated from Yale was 1974, and I had been involved and active in politics even as a high school student in Connecticut. And as I was, getting ready to graduate and I was trying to think, what should I do next? I applied to law school and I got into several law schools and wasn't really excited about it. And I decided to run for office instead. So I actually ran for the state Senate in Connecticut in a heavily Republican district as the Democratic candidate. And so, not surprisingly, I was defeated. But the day after my defeat, I got a call from Joe Lieberman saying that he had been watching my campaign and had been impressed with it. And he expected to be elected majority leader of the state Senate, and would I come and be the chief of staff for the Senate majority, which I did. And it was actually a better experience than being a freshman state senator might have been, because he was a wonderful mentor. He really exposed me to everything. In fact, here's a little anecdote that tells you a lot about him and also about how fortunate I was. I arrived at the state capitol in Hartford my first day, and the receptionist pointed to a desk in the reception area where she was also stationed and said, "This will be your desk." I said, "Fine." So I was sitting down and kind of organizing a bit and reading the morning paper, and in comes Senator Lieberman, and he welcomes me, and then he goes into his office and he comes back out and he says, "What are you doing there?" And I said, "Well, this is where I was told is my desk." And he said, "Oh, this isn't going to work." And then he said, "I have a very, very big office as the majority leader, and let's just move your desk in and we'll share my office." So he literally helped me pick up this desk, move it into this big office, and his desk was at the far end. And then there was a long conference table where the Democratic caucus would meet, and then my table was at the opposite end. And he never, ever asked me to leave. So the governor would come in to negotiate, or the caucus meetings would happen, the Republican leader would come to try to negotiate, and I sat in on everything and learned an enormous amount.
Were you able to keep in touch with him over the years? I mean, he must have taken great pride and also maybe grab a little credit for your subsequent success.
Well, he certainly should have grabbed some credit, and I think he was proud. It was very interesting, John. His kind of political positions and mine began to separate a bit. He became more conservative in many ways. Had started out as quite a progressive Democrat, but became more conservative, and so we disagreed on some issues. But we remained good friends, and I would see him at least once a year. And of course, he just passed away last year, unfortunately.
Well, Stephen, let's talk about you worked in Connecticut government for a time, and then you went to Prague working for the East-West Institute and this, enormously consequential time. I'm sure you could probably write a book about your time in Prague. But what do you remember most from that experience? What is sort of the central takeaways that have shaped how you look at the world and international affairs?
Well, I actually am thinking about writing a book about those years because it was so exciting and so inspirational, really. I arrived in Prague in June of 1990, so less than 6 months after the Velvet Revolution, and the first free elections took place in June. I was an election observer, in fact, and I was working not only in what was then still Czechoslovakia, but also Poland and Hungary, and later on, you know, Bulgaria, Romania, the Balkans, the Baltics, Ukraine, and the former Soviet Union over the course of that decade. So it was an extraordinary period. And we were working on trying to help with democracy reforms, with economic policy, and with new patterns of international relations and security. So the three most important domains of work. And, we worked with Lech Walesa and Václav Havel and Boris Yeltsin. I mean, the Gorbachev, the leaders of that remarkable period. So one of the most important lessons for me was the realization that democracy is far more than free elections. It's far more than functioning parliaments or the rule of law or the separation of powers. Democracy is a way of thinking and behaving and solving problems. It's really, as John Dewey described it, a civic faith. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the mechanics of democracy, voting and elections and the functions of government institutions, et cetera. And all of those are important. But unless there is also a very healthy, deeply rooted civic culture that trains people for their roles as citizens in democratic life, the institutions rest on very soft foundations. And I think this actually is part of the challenge we have in America today, that our civic culture has eroded, and as a result, our institutions are fragile. We've lost trust in the institutions. We've lost trust in the process. And in fact, we've lost trust with each other. And so this is the process of rebuilding civic faith and civic culture that I think is so important in America. So that was one lesson. A second lesson is that, ironically, we in the West, led primarily by the United States, rushed into Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union once it collapsed, preaching radical economic reform to the market economy. And that became the centerpiece. Even though we talked about democracy, the real work was about building capitalist economies and opening up markets, frankly, for Western business. And as a result, particularly in places like Russia, a few people got extraordinarily wealthy, and the majority of people became quite poor. And they associate this with democracy because that's how we market it to them. And so they've lost faith in democracy, which is why, you get a Vladimir Putin able to take power and run Russia as an autocracy. So that's a second important lesson to me. And the third was that when it came to international relations, we spent more time lecturing them about how they should join Western institutions and what they had to do in order to accomplish that than we did really listening to them and understanding what their security concerns would be and how we might adjust to their needs and their red lines. And so those were kind of the core lessons that came to me over almost a decade of work in the region.
Well, I look forward to reading the book. So, Stephen, let's talk a little bit about your work in creating Demos. What were you? I mean, even back then, there were a fair number of think tanks and policy institutes and so forth. What particular niche were you trying to address or to take care of?
Yeah, well, it actually directly links to the conversation we just had, because part of the reason I went to Eastern Europe was that after 15 years in state government with, extraordinary experience, I had two different cabinet positions in the state government, as well as having worked in the legislature. But I was becoming a little bit jaded about politics, because I saw even then in the 1980s the corrupting influence of money in politics and the manipulation of democratic systems for personal gain. And so watching the folks in Eastern Europe reclaim democracy from the bottom up in peaceful revolutions was just terribly inspiring to me, which is one of the reasons why I decided to find a way to go there. So, having had the experience I had, I wanted to come back to the United States and re engage in American civic life and started having conversations and networking with people about how I might best contribute. And another colleague and I decided we would organize a set of conversations about creating a new think tank that would focus on the connection between economic inequality in America and political inequality in America, and try to offer research and policy proposals and then conduct advocacy around them in order to create a more equitable and more robust democratic society in America. And that's what Demos has been doing ever since.
And it's totally flourishing now. It's become really one of the really critical institutions in the kind of the public policy realm.
Yes,
Stephen,
I'm
let's talk
very
about the
proud of it.
Rockefeller Brothers Fund. You've been there since 2001, almost a quarter century. You had a chance to read about it. It was created in I think 1940 by the sons of John and Amy Aldrich Rockefeller. Has an endowment about 1.2 billion. Talk about the fund. What should our listeners know about its work?
Well, this is a really quite extraordinary organization that I've been privileged to lead for all these years now. It was created by the third generation of the Rockefeller family. So, and this was David Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, et cetera. Nelson, who went on to be governor of New York and vice president of the U.S. under Jerry Ford, and David Rockefeller, who became chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, and one of the other brothers became governor in Arkansas as a Republican and led the civil rights reform movement there. Really an interesting group of brothers. And they decided in 1940, as very young men, the oldest was, I think, 35 and the youngest was 25, to work together in philanthropy. And their father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., encouraged them to do so. And that's how RBF got started. And from the beginning, we've really studied the history. From the beginning, there were three core interests of the family and of the RBF. And those were conservation of land and open spaces, international affairs, and civic life. And over the 80 some years now of the fund's history, those three things have always been present in our grant making, they have evolved, of course, so that now we talk about sustainable development and not conservation, and we talk about peace building, not just international relations, and we talk about democratic practice, not just civic life. And we have a very active grants budget that works in the United States and in various places around the world, including China and the Western Balkans and the Middle East and Central America, on those three sets of issues, primarily strengthening democracy, combating climate change, and trying to promote peace in conflict zones. I have a fantastic team of people, and of course, wonderful grantee partners who do the hard work.
Well, Stephen, you've been credited with pioneering the concept of acupuncture philanthropy. Tell us what that is in its essence, and maybe give us an example or two of what it means in like the world that you work in.
The notion is that we at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and in the field of philanthropy overall really have rather modest resources to use. If you total up all American foundation giving in a year, it's probably something around 300 billion. So 300 billion compared to the scale of the problems that we are trying to address, like climate change or like democracy or like peace, is really very, very little money. So the analogy with acupuncture is that we have to, like acupuncture, we have to think of our resources like the little needles of acupuncture and figure out where to insert them in a way that triggers some larger systemic change. And that's the goal, is to use modest resources and have a significant impact. So it's very challenging work. There's no formula for this. It's an art as well as a science in some ways. But I'll give you what I think is a very good example. In 2001, following the terrible events of 9/11 and the terrorist attack, we began thinking about what RBF should do differently under the new world situation. And I began thinking not only about the Sunni Arab world, which is where the terrorists, of course, came from, but I started thinking about Iran, a Shia country in the middle of the Sunni Arab world, and the fact that we didn't have diplomatic relations with Iran because of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the hostage crisis. So we had no diplomatic relations, and yet Iran was becoming more and more important in the region. It was building a nuclear program that people were beginning to worry about might be an effort to build nuclear weapons. And yet we had no way of talking directly to the Iranian government. So working with some friends and colleagues who had been former US diplomats, we decided to organize what is known as a Track 2 process, where this group of very skilled, very highly respected Americans would meet with a similar group from Tehran, obviously in a third location, for confidential discussions about all the issues in the US-Iran relationship, in particular the nuclear issue, and work together to generate some ideas that we then shared with our respective governments over a multi-year period that helped pave the way for the famous JCPOA Iran nuclear deal of 2015. And we know from what Secretary Kerry and even President Obama and others said to us that without this work that we had been doing for many, many years, it would have been far more difficult for the two governments to finally get talking to each other and to come to an agreement about the nuclear program. And that didn't cost us a lot of money. It was a relatively small expense of our funds, but it had a significant impact. So that's, to me, a really good example of this idea of acupuncture philanthropy.
Great. Well, Stephen, let's talk about a logic for the future. And as I understand it, you are the recipient of the Robert Bosch Fellowship, which allows recipients to spend a period of time in Berlin to study issues. And I was looking at their website, and they said about this fellowship, and they said their hope is to find recipients who would engage and study beyond their normal professional commitments and then adds that it hopes that they would work on future-oriented topics in an international context. So I think you definitely met the requirements, but as you received this fellowship and pondered this work, I mean, you undertook probably the most comprehensive of subjects. I mean, what impelled you to go big and broad? And also, were there a couple books or things in particular that really got you initially focused on the framework you developed?
Yeah. Well, first, John, I have to say I was so lucky. This is again, another example of how fortunate I've been throughout my career. I This was not a fellowship you apply for. I just went to my computer one morning and opened up my inbox, and here was this letter saying I had been selected for this fellowship. Come to Berlin. We'll give you an office, stay for as much as a year. We'll help you find a place to live. We'll give you a stipend. I mean, it was, at first I thought it was spam. This can't be, this can't be possible. But sure enough, it was real. And thankfully, the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was willing to give me a 5 month sabbatical so that I could go to Berlin. And then the Bosch Academy asks you to identify a topic that you will work on during the fellowship. And, given what was happening in the world and given my own career in international relations, I really was worried about the growing anachronism and ineffectiveness of the existing international system. And I wanted to study its origins and its history and its evolution, and to kind of analyze its strengths and weaknesses, and then to think creatively about how it needed to be revised, amended, redesigned, reinvented even for the challenges we face in the 21st century. So it was an enormously big topic. And when I arrived in Berlin, and there were about 6 or 7 other fellows, very distinguished, wonderful group of people, each working on their own project, but we would all meet together twice a week and help each other. But when I started first introducing this topic, everybody said, "Oh, well, that'll be easy. You should be done in about a month." Everybody was thinking I was crazy to even take this on, and in some ways, I was crazy. But on the other hand, it turned out to be enormously productive. And I feel very, very good about the work that I accomplished. And to your question about some of the sources of research and inspiration, one was a book not about international relations. And that is a book that was written by Peter Drucker in 1980. Peter Drucker, the great management consultant and guru. And the book was called Managing in Turbulent Times. And it was largely a book for corporate CEOs. But his thesis was this: the real threat in times of turbulence is not actually the turbulence itself. He said, it's acting with yesterday's logic. And as I was thinking about the international system and the turbulence we face in this world today from a variety of sources, it struck me that that's exactly the position we are in. We are facing very turbulent times, and yet, by and large, we're reacting with yesterday's logic. So I then set out to think about, well, what are the core elements of that logic? And I identified 12, and then I interrogated each of them to say, all right, which ones of these should we keep in a logic for the future? Which ones should we retire? Which ones should be revised and how? And what new things might we invent? And then after completing that exercise, I said, all right, if this is a proposed logic for the future, how would we apply this logic in reorganizing the international system itself? And I offered 10 kind of building blocks. But the way this came about was that I started at the beginning. I went back and read the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648, which is the document that is most often credited for giving birth to the notion of national sovereignty. And then I studied the 30 Years' War and the end of the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna, the First World War, the League of Nations, the Second World War, the United Nations, the Cold War, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, et cetera. And from that review of history and all kinds of books and articles and interviews, some wonderful interviews, um, is how I kind of conducted this research work and then set out this framework. Another book of a very different kind that inspired me is a novel. And it's a science fiction novel written by Kim Stanley Robinson, and it's called A Ministry for the Future. And I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic read. It's somewhat dystopian because he's looking out, to 2040 or 2045 and sees a world that is suffering massive disruptions due to climate change primarily, but that is causing conflict and loss of life, et cetera. And finally, the UN creates a ministry for the future to try to manage this global crisis and appoints an Irish diplomat, a woman, to be the minister. And it's a fantastic book. And that was also a source of inspiration from a fictional perspective. And actually now Stan and I have become friends, and we're doing gigs together. I'm doing an event with him in San Francisco in March rather, and then we're going to do another one in New York in April.
Wow, very interesting. Well, Stephen, let's talk about some of the kind of inheritances and encumbrances from the past, some of the logics and how they should be kind of reassessed. The first one is the one that you touched on, the whole notion of sovereignty, as you say, kind of enshrined by the Peace of Westphalia, has been considered one of the sort of the constants in the international system. Although, as you point out, there's been some interesting and maybe not fully appreciated innovations from the EU and its extraordinary work, and even happened in New York in 2005, the responsibility to protect doctrine that was in a General Assembly, UN General Assembly product. So talk about just the power of sovereignty and how we need to rethink about sovereignty.
Sure. Sovereignty clearly is kind of, in some ways, the centerpiece of the logic of the past. And it is a 17th century concept. And I'm not suggesting that we throw it out. And in my assessment, I think sovereignty is still very important and useful, but we need to think of it quite differently. And we need to support these new innovations, these forms of collective or shared sovereignty, because the problems we need to address are outside the capacity of nation states, sovereign nation states, to solve on their own, or even in the multilateral organizations that are made up of independent sovereign nation states. We need to think much more flexibly and much more creatively about some planetary bodies to manage truly planetary challenges. And we also need to think about subnational jurisdictions of governance where the challenges, let's say, of climate change are actually affecting individuals, like the terrible fires we've just seen in California. So we've got to devolve power both up and down and create more capacity at both the planetary and at the local levels and at the global regional levels. So the EU is an extraordinary example of shared sovereignty. 27 member states who came together and each give up some of their independent sovereignty because they get greater benefits from the collective sovereignty that they enjoy in the union itself. It's probably the most important political development of the 20th century. It's not perfect. It needs reform, and they're working on reforming the EU. But it is a very, very important model. But so is the African Union. So is ASEAN in East Asia. And there are other models that are developing that I think we need to both appreciate and also support and help build their capacity.
Well, following from that, Stephen, I mean, you talk about the primacy of national interest versus a kind of an awareness and focus on the global commons. Develop that sort of that construct.
Exactly. If again, most sovereign nation states uh, have followed a a global policy or a foreign policy that is in pursuit of their national interests as they define them. And that is in economic affairs, it's in security affairs, et cetera. And that's natural. That's what we expect sovereign states to do, especially in democratic states. We elect leaders who we want to protect our interests. At the same time, there are actions that sovereign states take that are self-interested and contrary to global interests. So, just as an example, if a recent example, if President Trump has concluded again that being part of the Paris Agreement on climate change, in his view, is not in the national interests of the United States, he made the decision to withdraw, as he did in his first term. This undermines the global interests of solving the climate crisis, because without the United States actively engaged in reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions and helping others to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, we have no chance of achieving the less than 2-degree world that the Paris Agreement is committed to. So there's a case where one government's, one leader's view of national interests contradicts what I think we can see as a global interest. And what I'm suggesting is that we have to look more expansively at our national interests over a longer period of time. And in the climate example, recognize that our national interest is helping the rest of the world avoid the worst of the climate catastrophe, because the climate catastrophe will affect us just as it affects everybody else. No matter what we do with our own emissions, others will continue to emit as well, and we will continue to have wildfires, floods, loss of crops, loss of livelihoods, loss of lives, et cetera. So there's a really good example where we have to kind of dilute the importance of national interests and expand the importance of common interests or global interests.
And I should add, the backdrop of your essay is that of this turbulent era with, 3, as you call them, existential crises, including climate, nuclear proliferation, and then, hyper development of technology in terms of AI, et cetera. So, these 3 huge existential issues, do not lend themselves to a nation by nation response.
Exactly. And that's what makes this period, that's why I call this the Age of Turbulence. What makes this different from the turbulence that has occurred throughout history is I don't think there's ever been a period where there have been 3 existential threats of this nature happening simultaneously at a global level. And that makes this qualitatively different than what humanity has faced in the past. And nation states alone are not going to be able to manage these crises. We have to find ways to work together collaboratively.
One of the other logics you talk about is just the sort of accumulation of power by the great powers, whether it's the Permanent Five in the UN, the G7, versus the fact that much of the world is not part of this kind of this arrangement. You call them, sometimes they're referred to as the global South. You refer to them as the global majority, reminding
Right.
us that they are, in fact, are the majority of the people in the world. But talk about this sort of this logic we need to reassess.
Yes, this is a very important part of the shift from the logic of the past to a logic for the future. The logic of the past was great power dominance, and that was true in the Congress of Vienna. It was true in the League of Nations for the period in which it survived, and of course, it was enshrined in the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council. But the world is quite different than 1945, when the UN Security Council was created. The P5 are important powers, but the rising powers, the middle powers, and even the developing world are all now clamoring for more influence in international affairs and more equity in the solving of global problems. And they are no longer sitting on the sidelines. And they resent being forced to choose in an us or them kind of equation, like the one we had in the Cold War. You were either with the United States and the NATO allies, or you were with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Those countries that tried to survive in the middle, some of them successfully, but it was not an easy experience. I think that we have to accept the reality that we are now living in a multipolar world, a world in which power is more diffused, and we have to accept that. We're not going to put that, toothpaste back in the tube. It's the world we are going to live in, and we have a role in helping to make that function effectively and equitably. And U.S. leadership is essential, but we cannot try to preserve great power dominance in a world that won't accept it and shouldn't accept it, frankly.
Well, and this leads in nicely into your sort of building blocks for the future, because one of the first ones, actually the first one, is talking about building an international system of the future, in which you talk about having this sort of co-creation between the kind of legacy powers and then also the kind of rising, aspiring global majority, and having this new system being built on multi, pillars as opposed to just one pillar.
Yes. This is what we did in 1945. The United States, in particular, under the leadership first of FDR and then Harry Truman, invited the world to come together around a set of principles to create the United Nations in order to prevent another outbreak of World War of the type that had been experienced in World War I and in the Second World War. And at that moment, in 1945, the U.S. was the undisputed hegemon on the world stage, and so literally the U.S. could invite the world to be part of that conversation, but with a very kind of dominant U.S. Proposal and U.S. perspective on what the UN should be and how it should function, et cetera. And the world was ready to accept that. Wasn't easy. Getting the charter adopted was an act of political will and also of imagination. And it served us quite well for most of the 20th century. Now we are in a different kind of world. The US is no longer the global hegemon. We have these rising powers and competing powers, and we need to accommodate that and, again, make it work effectively to create less violent conflict, more equitable distribution of resources and wealth, and a sustainable planet in this century. And so, in my ideal world, and I acknowledge in my paper that some of my ideas might strike readers as being a bit utopian or at least idealistic. In my ideal world, I would love to see a president of the United States go to the UN General Assembly and invite the world into that kind of conversation. And technically, that would mean, to help launch a UN Charter Review Commission, which you can do under Article 109 of the UN Charter. But since that's not likely to happen in the near term, I think having this conversation in other settings and getting people to think about what is the system we need and how can we accomplish parts of that system on an incremental basis, because that's how change is likely to happen, that builds into something that is more systemic over a period of years. And those conversations are underway. I was very impressed that President Lula of Brazil actually in his General Assembly speech last September called for a charter review process, and others are doing the same. And some think tanks and civil society organizations on a global basis have actually drafted a new charter as an example and as something to test people's concepts and ideas. And this is exactly the kind of process we need to do. And I would like to see the U.S. providing that kind of leadership, frankly.
Well, Stephen, in two kind of tangible ways. I mean, there's been a lot more discussion about Security Council reform in the last few years, and this is one of these perennial issues that it's always discussed, and actually effectuating it is extraordinarily difficult. But there are some discussions, hinging on expanding the Security Council and maybe trying to do something with the veto power. And also, and I was struck by this, the General Assembly seems to be asserting itself in recent years in a way that it really had not for much of its history. So there's some things that are going on even now that portend some potentially good developments at the UN.
That's exactly right. I was very pleased that Secretary General Guterres launched a process to have a summit of the future at the UN immediately after the General Assembly session last September. It was a summit of heads of state with a lot of preparation and negotiation over a 2 year period in advance. And it was a difficult process. The negotiations were intense, um, even to the very literally the last minute when they were getting ready to try to adopt the text of a pact for the future, which I encourage our audience to have a look at, because it is an important step forward. The pact actually sets out a number of actions that the international community now pledges to take, including serious work on Security Council reform. It's the most far-reaching proposal on Security Council reform of, of the last probably 20 or 30 years. Does it go far enough? No, it does not. But it is, considering it was adopted in a unanimous process by 190 UN member states, it's quite an extraordinary step forward, and it provides the basis for further work, idea development, policy proposal, and a lot of public education and advocacy, because these very good ideas will not happen unless there is political will that is built through public education, mobilization, and advocacy.
One of the other concepts you talk about, which intrigues me, is you say train, recruit, and deploy a new generation of diplomats. And it's striking. I mean, there's quite a bit of
I'm sorry.
at whatever level actually work, you know. And so this strikes me as really speaking to that, to develop this new generation of diplomats with maybe wider ranging skills, maybe more of an international perspective than just, you know. So talk a little about your aspirations in this realm.
Yes, I really think that one of the most important things we should do, and we can do, this is not a hard one, is to really put much greater emphasis on diplomacy and diplomatic capacity to solve global problems. We have under-supported diplomacy. The State Department does a remarkable job given the scale of resources that are provided to it by the Congress, but it really could use a lot more. And this is true not only in the US, this is a problem in many countries around the world. So that's one thing. First, we just need to invest in more diplomacy. But then the second thing is I think we need to invest in diplomacy that is really about global problem management, problem solving, as opposed to national interest, for example. I mean, national interest will be there, but there needs to be this complementary understanding of global issues. And so what I'm suggesting is that there be an international group of educators from schools of international relations and from diplomatic academies that come together in a process to create a global diplomacy curriculum, hopefully based on some of the ideas of a logic for the future, so that there is a cadre of diplomats in the world that are thinking in a very future-oriented way and serving both their countries and the globe in ways that solve these massive problems that we have. And I think if people are trained together in a new way of thinking about diplomacy, they will end up working together more effectively as diplomats as they pursue their careers. And so it has all kinds of benefits. Now, the encouraging thing is that a number of schools of international relations have approached me and said they think this is a really valuable idea. And so we are exploring how actually this might begin to take place.
Very interesting. Stephen, in your paper, you talk a lot about China and the United States. And at one point, you write, it is not an exaggeration to say that as US-China relations go, so goes the 21st century. And one specific proposal that you have developed, which I understand you've actually discussed in several meetings in China and received a careful hearing, was creating this a secretariat, which would be government officials from the two countries that would be, meeting regularly, whether it's in Geneva or Singapore. And just as these important issues come on the radar, just having a kind of some kind of mechanism to process them, to sort of talk about them, explore, if you would, your notion on this.
The idea is that the communications between the U.S. and China are really critically important, and the management of this relationship is, just the most consequential bilateral relationship of the 21st century. And I give a lot of credit to our diplomats in Beijing at our embassy, and also the State Department officials who work on China, and the same to the Chinese. And I've been going and traveling to China since 1979, and I was there last October for it was my 24th trip. Um, but these episodic dialogues between US and Chinese officials, as essential as they are not enough. We need to be developing a much deeper knowledge and understanding of each other. And I think that that can happen more effectively if we create a kind of permanent structure, which I call a secretariat, where we have Chinese officials from the key ministries of the Chinese government at the working level. I'm not talking about ministers or deputy ministers. I'm talking about directors of bureaus and that level of foreign officer or civil servant. And the same from the US, who are seconded on a multi-year basis to some place like Singapore or Geneva, where they are working in the same building together on a day-to-day basis. And it's a place where they can have informal conversations, they can test each other's aspirations, they can explore each other's red lines in the world, they can develop ideas and proposals for their respective governments, and keep the conversation and the dialogue and the learning going on a daily basis as opposed to an episodic basis. And I think of this in part because of how Henry Kissinger in 1971, in his secret mission to Beijing, where he spent so much time with Zhou Enlai, and Kissinger's approach was not to go to China and tell Zhou Enlai what the US wanted in Asia or in the world. His approach was to go to China and listen to Zhou Enlai and to ask him, what are China's aspirations? How do you see China's role in the world? What kind of relationship would you like to have with the United States? What kind of relationship do you want to continue to have with the Soviet Union? How do you see your neighbors? I mean, it was really an intensive process of getting into the Chinese mind and understanding their motivations and their fears and their aspirations. And from that kind of dialogue, then beginning to build a framework in which the US and China could ultimately come to diplomatic recognition and the trip of President Nixon to China. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to be having again. This conversation in which we are deeply listening to each other and learning and finding areas of common ground while also being clear about the areas in which we do not yet share common ground.
And as I saw you in an interview, you made this presentation to some Chinese officials. I mean, they were think tank people and university folks and so forth, but people with serious international experience, and they were intrigued. Of course, they're not in a position to agree or to accept it, but it seemed like it struck a chord that they'd like to think about this some more.
And yes, to be honest, I was expecting them to perhaps just reject it out of hand, and that did not happen. They were intrigued, and they thought it was useful to have this idea in the public discourse. And it might be useful to see if something like this could even be tested in an unofficial kind of structure, a think tank to think tank kind of structure, which would be very interesting, I think.
Well, Stephen, one of the pillars of your look to the future is a transformed American approach to leadership. And I want to read a couple sentences from your paper in which you say, this is a time of profound global turbulence that requires innovative new forms of broader and deeper global cooperation and fundamental changes in the style and content of U.S. global leadership. You go on to say the U.S. must play a leading role in shaping a global response, but we need a bold and fundamentally different vision of America's role in the interdependent world of the 21st century. You go on to say it is a time for a new vision of America's role in the world based on an understanding that what's good for the world is good for us. This is maybe the best statement of not America first that I have heard. What I mean, so let's tackle the big issue. You know, obviously Donald Trump would his approach to the United States, his vision of the United States, you know, does not fit in smoothly with your logic of the future. You fully understand that. I've seen you say in interviews too. Well, first of all, you said kind of in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way, you say you toggle between pessimism or sort of anxiety and nervous optimism.
Right.
But and then you also say that the one thing about Donald Trump is that you put it maybe more diplomatic than this, but there's not as an it's not a fully coherent worldview. So even though his inclinations are different than what you support, there might be some windows of opportunity that people should seize on. So develop your thoughts there.
Yes, exactly. I ran out of the original printing of this paper, which is a nice problem to have. So we are reprinting it, and two things happened since the first publication. One was the Summit of the Future that took place in September, and the other was the election of Donald Trump. So I went back through the original text, specifically with those two events in mind, to see what parts of the text might need to be revised. And when it came to the section about US global leadership, I read it very closely again, and I decided not to change a word. I feel actually that what I articulated in the first version is maybe even more important today than it was at the time that I wrote it, more applicable to the challenges today than even it was in the middle of last year. And I think that there are these quirky moments of opportunity. You know, probably the only thing we can predict about President Trump with any confidence is that he's going to be unpredictable. And we're seeing that already in the first weeks. Some things we could have predicted. You know, he told us things he was going to do. Some of us might not have believed he was actually going to follow through, but he is. But on the other hand, he is already surprising us in some ways too. And we've talked about two of them already in a way. One of them is Iran, and the other is China. So in the first Trump administration, of course, his approach to Iran was to tear up the nuclear agreement of 2015 that we at RBF had helped in our own small way to develop, and to take the approach of maximum pressure on Iran, which failed because we kept increasing the pressure and the Iranians kept building nuclear centrifuges and nuclear capacity. So in these early weeks of the Trump administration, what we are seeing is that the people who ran the policy of maximum pressure in the first Trump administration did not get positions in the second Trump administration. And some people who have argued for avoiding a war with Iran as the number one priority are now in positions of some importance and responsibility in the second Trump administration. And Trump himself has recently said that he hopes there can be a negotiated settlement to this nuclear question. So there's an opening that we might not have expected, and rather than just criticizing the Trump administration kind of across the board, I think we who are engaged in these kinds of issues need to be very pragmatic, and we need to be flexible and nimble to take advantage of these moments of opportunity that are going to occur, that are occurring, and try to make progress. And the same is true of China. You know, in the campaign, he talked about applying 60% tariffs across the board, and already he's signaling that, maybe there's a way to avoid, a trade war. And again, his team has some China hawks, but they may not be the dominant voices. And Trump likes to make deals. I think there are opportunities here. So yes, his kind of meta philosophy about America first is not at all consistent with my view of how I would like to see the US behaving in the world. On the other hand, I think he does want to avoid war. I think he wants to try to be the deal maker that solves potential conflict. And that provides an opportunity to make some progress on some parts of the agenda.
Well, Stephen, in terms of your paper, I mean, I have to think that this has surpassed your wildest expectations. I mean, it has gotten generated a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations. What next? I mean, how would you like this paper and the ideas that you've developed? How would you like it to move forward over the next couple of years? What is the next step as you
Well,
see it?
I really appreciate your reactions to it, John, and I have been surprised and very pleased with the kinds of reactions and interest that the paper has generated. And by the way, I do want to say to our viewers that you can find it on the RBF website very easily. You just Google a logic for the future, and you can find it. So I am continuing to do a lot of speaking and organizing of seminars and conferences with a variety of partners to advance these ideas and to generate debate. I don't claim to have the answer here. I claim to have some ideas, and I am really interested in how my ideas engage with other ideas, and how from that kind of debate and discussion we can actually move an agenda forward that accomplishes some real change in the world. So that's what I'm working on. The paper itself really demands to be a full book. Each one of these segments could be a chapter, should be a chapter. I just didn't have time to do it. As I look back on it, I kind of feel that it was a miracle that I was able to produce what I produced. But at some point in the next couple of years, I might try to spend more time on this and develop it into a book. But at the same time, I'm actually trying to work with a variety of partners on a couple of the recommendations to actually see if we can move them forward as individual projects. And one of them is this global diplomacy curriculum. The other is this idea of some kind of informal US-China kind of secretariat process. And there are others as well. So, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity to be with you and your audience to have this conversation. And I hope it has been stimulating for the viewers and raises some ideas in their minds as well. So thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
Right. And Stephen, let me just ask you one final question, which is since we do have students on this call, as you look back on your career and the things that have happened, what advice would you give them as they begin to launch their careers and think about professional careers? I mean, what did you wish? What do you wish you knew when you were 22 years old and starting out in Connecticut politics? What have you learned now that you wish you knew back then?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is to think about a career in public service, in global service. And I think of the example of Senator Paul Simon, who was such a remarkable leader, and I had the opportunity to meet him and work with him on a couple of things over the years. And a career in public service right now can look very unappealing to people because of the hyper partisan nature of our politics and the ugliness of a lot of public and political discourse and the whole challenges of the social media environment. All of these factors make public service less and less appealing. But I would really urge students to put those aside and to pursue careers in public service because you can change it. And that is a really important lesson for me. In my own small career, I have actually contributed to change in some not unimportant ways. And you can do this. And it's a very rewarding experience when you contribute to something that's larger than yourself. The second thing, I really urge everybody to live and work outside the United States at some point in your career, not too late in your career, because it changes you, and it changes you for the better. It gives you a very different perspective on yourself, on our country. I'm a true American patriot, and I came home very engaged in this country, but I learned a lot about this country by living and working outside of it for nearly a decade. So those are the two things I would say: get engaged and live out in the world and experience the world as you also think about the future of the US.
Perfect. And I might tell everyone they can start by reading a copy of Stephen's paper, A Logic for the Future. You can get it online. Just Google it, and you will find it in multiple places, including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And it's it's an interesting, it's a very accessible read, and it's just a really important way to help think about the world that we now face. Stephen, thank you so much for really a terrific conversation. It's been great to learn about you and your work. And I look forward to staying in touch. And if we can help in any way, we'd love to participate in this really important endeavor that you're involved in.
Thank you very much, John. And again, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
All
And
right.
thanks to all of you for watching another installment of our show. We will have this conversation with Stephen on our website in the coming days. Please show it to family and friends. Thank you for supporting the Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.